One question asked me to talk about and do a breakdown of senior officers within the Roman army, particularly the senatorial equestrian officers. Now, I will do at some point a much longer video on command structure, army officers, career patterns within the Roman army, but I thought I'd do a short answer, a summary of it all today, so we can look at the senior officers in the Roman army and, at a glance have some idea of who they were likely to be, what sort of experience they had, some idea of age. You've basically got the two main groups. You've got the senatorial officers who are the most senior, and equestrian officers who have senior posts but not as senior as the Senate. Because obviously the senatorial class are the elite of the Roman Empire. There are some 600 or so of them. That's the number Augustus whittles the total down to, and it stays around about that figure. There are at the very least tens of thousands of equestrians out there, many of whom don't have a public career, don't go into the army at all, but nevertheless you're drawing from a much bigger body of people. They're all Roman citizens. You require a pretty high property qualification to become an equestrian and a very high one to become a senator. You also need to own land in Italy to be a senator, but that doesn't mean you're from Italy. You just have to be a Roman citizen, as the same with the equestrians. So over time an awful lot of senators will be ethnically Spanish, North African, Cappadocian, whatever it might be, from all over the empire. There's no evidence yet for a Roman senator coming from Britain, but that's fairly rare. Most provinces produce at least one or two, and some produce quite a lot. Though again, there are patterns and differences within that. So we're looking at the army in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and to some extent into the 3rd century AD, but things will change in the 3rd century. So really, let's say from Augustus to the end of the Severan dynasty in the 230s AD. And that's the army that we imagine. It's the army of the reenactment groups in the main. It's the army of the Hadrian's Wall, of the bases, the forts throughout the empire. So you've got your grades of officer, you've got the senatorial officers at the top, the equestrian officers, and then below them you have the centurionate that we've talked about a little bit before, won't do too much on today. Senatorial officers generally have 3 posts of a military nature, sometimes slightly more, depending on their seniority. With everybody, you might not go through the full career. You might decide that after you've done the early stages that you're not going to bother. There are some senators who don't seek a public career at all. They've been enrolled because of their status, because of their parents, but they might not necessarily do very much or follow it to any great extent. In the same way, you have someone like Antoninus Pius, who's emperor, but has probably never left Italy, whereas a lot of people on imperial service will get around quite a lot. Anyway, first stage is junior for you, but still a senior post in the army, and this is late teens, early 20s. You go off and become a broad stripe tribune in one of the legions. Now, by the time of Trajan, there are probably about 30 legions, slight exception for the ones in Egypt that work differently, but we won't worry about them today. So there are about 28 posts of senior tribune of a legion available at any one time. And you go off, you are, by social status, and many people assume by military command status, you're the second in command of the legion. So even though you've come with no formal military experience before, you're supposed to be prepared for this by your upbringing. You should know how to fight, how to ride a horse. You should have some idea of command, of speeches. It's this Roman concept that you learn about how to be a senator by following around family members, friends, other senators, seeing what they're doing and copying that. And you read about it and you're educated and you're brought up with the expectation that you're going to be able to do these things. And it gives you an immense self-confidence that you can go out and do this. Some sources, you've got famously Tacitus, a biography of his father-in-law Agricola, who contrasts Agricola as a very diligent tribune who's trying to learn how to be a good soldier, how to be a good staff officer, with the those who are just out to party their way through the minimum time they've got to serve in the provinces before they can go back to Rome and get on with the next stage of their career. As impression, some men may only have served for 6 months, perhaps a year. Serving longer than a year does seem to have happened. How common it was is hard to say. Again, it's going to depend on how many people each year there are seeking the office and how many posts there are available as well, in part. There's Pliny, when he's praising the new emperor Trajan, goes on at great length about how Trajan served an exceptionally long time as a military tribune because he really wanted to be a good soldier, and how, you know, he wore out his equipment and his weapons and all this sort of thing through hard service and fighting and all this sort of stuff. This is a speech praising the emperor, so you have to take it with more than a pinch of salt, but there does seem to have been a pattern that some people, by inclination, temperament, ability, took this more seriously, got more out of it than others. But it's still probably unlikely you did more than 2 or 3 years as a rule, though there may have been a few exceptions, and many did less. Then you go back to the career that brings you much more civilian offices over the next period. Until around about the age of 30, you would be the legate, the legatus, legionis, the commander of a legion. So again, because Egypt's a little bit different, you've got about 28 posts most of the time in most years available for someone to go off and command the legion. That's obviously a body of 5,000 or so men. In some cases, if that legion is the only legion stationed in a province, then you might also combine this role with being governor of that province. So, for instance, Judea in the aftermath of the Jewish rebellion, so post 70, for a long time there's only Legio Tenth as garrison of the province. It's got a legion for the first time, and the legatus of the legion is the provincial governor as well. More often than not, most legions are in provinces that have another legion at least there as well. From Domitian onwards, it's very rare for any province to have more than 2 legions in it, but there are a few exceptions, and even those, they get broken up under Septimius Severus and that sort of period, or in the latter part of the 2nd century. So, for instance, Britain is divided into 2, one with 2 legions, one with 1, instead of one single command with 3 legions. There's not a lot of information, but the sort of rule of thumb guesswork tends to be, for most of these things, that we assume people have 3 years or so in post. But again, very hard to say. And there's probably variation, again, depending on temperament, ability. These are imperial posts, so you have to be named for this by the emperor. And that's even more true of the next stage, which will tend to happen when you're 40-ish, around about that. You've had the consulship already. You will go on to become the legatus Augusti of a military province, so commanding 2 or more legions. And the really important ones, Britain, Syria, Pannonia at times, where you might be commanding 3 or 4, very often you will get those only after you've actually commanded an ordinary province. Again, 3 years seems a rule of thumb for how long you're likely to hold this post, but it's very vague. Some are longer, some are probably shorter. These are, you know, the key posts within the empire, because obviously these are people who have an army at their command, so could be potential rivals to the emperor, and they are watched very, very closely. And of course they are the emperor's men. Being a legatus, same word means ambassador. You are a representative of the emperor, so the power you have, the imperium you have, is delegated from the emperor. It's not yours by right, like an old proconsul in the Republican period. So again, you will have done other things, but those are the 3 main periods of military service for senatorial officers. You have senatorial officers as senior tribune in a legion, as commander of a legion, and then governor, commander of a province and its army. And sometimes then, you know, there's more than one type of province. So it's always possible somebody could actually command a province while they're in charge of one legion because it's a small one, and then go on to command an ordinary one and perhaps even one of the big ones. But it varies. If you are getting those posts, you are someone that the emperor thinks is reliable. And to what extent they balance genuine talent as a military man, as an administrator, as a dispenser of justice, with simple loyalty, in that, yeah, this fellow might be better, but I'm not sure I can rely on him. I can't trust him if I give him this command of this army. Very hard to say. It will vary from emperor to emperor. And, you know, Tiberius is criticised for keeping people in post far too long, which meant that there weren't as many jobs to share around with everyone else. But that could be a question of, well, these are the people he trusts, but it might be, is that trust based on loyalty, or is it based on ability, or is it based on both? Domitian's appointments, even though he's an unpopular emperor, seem on the whole to be rather sensible. You know, even Nero at times is appointing good people. So it varies and it's complicated, but that's effectively the senatorial career. So late teens, early 20s, tribune, 30-ish command a legion, 40-ish command a province with several legions. And in between you've had various civil posts and other posts, and you might govern a senatorial province with few, if any, soldiers. So the senators are the top of the pyramid, both socially but also in terms of their status and their command. You've then got equestrian officers. Now, the equestrian military career follows a distinct pattern, but it's rather harder to tie in with a broader pattern of civilian officers and pin this down to particular ages, levels of experience when you get there. There's a lot less we know about this, because even though more of these careers are recorded, they don't tend to tell us that much. They just list the units involved. So an equestrian officer would normally go and begin his military career, the 3 military posts, by commanding an auxiliary cohort. So he'd be, normally the title is prefect, with a few units it might be tribune instead if it's, but again, we'll talk about that another time. Most of these are units with a paper strength of around about the 500 mark, so 480 for an infantry cohort, 480 infantry plus 120 for a mixed unit, and 500-ish for a cavalry ala. But you would first command a cohort of infantry. Infantry are your starting point. We don't know how old you generally were when you were given this post. There are a few teenagers recorded, so it's quite possible that if you had the influence, then you could get this sort of job at a very young age, but that probably wasn't normal. We'd perhaps expect them to be in their 20s at the very least, but we don't know. That is guesswork. And we don't quite know how they were selected. A letter from Pliny writing to the governor of a military province talks about trying to get commissions and jobs for some of Pliny's friends, because by this time you've been there a while, you must have satisfied all your own friends and dependents. So at least recommendation could come from somebody other than the emperor, but probably, at least for the more senior posts, there's a level of the name's going to be passed through and the emperor would know who's in charge, but he might not be controlling it so directly. But there are records kept in Rome about all of this. So you command an auxiliary cohort that might well be stationed on its own. It could occupy one of these forts of the type we know, so familiar from Vinlander, from Hausteds, from the many in Germany and elsewhere. You could operate independently. You can become the local representative of the Roman Empire. There's the Barbatha archive from among the Dead Sea Scrolls of where a prefect of a cavalry unit, so slightly senior from our cohort commander, but still commander of an auxiliary unit, is there as effectively the sort of officialdom. He represents the Roman Empire when it comes to legal pronouncements, legal recognition of property ownership, transfer, all that sort of thing. So you could be left on your own devices. You are, to some extent your own boss, and you see something of their social life from the Vinlander tablets. Flavius Cerealis, of the Batavian cohort there at Vindlander is one of these equestrian cohort commanders, though again his situation might be slightly peculiar because of his family and the peculiarities of that unit, something we can talk about another time, because he does appear to be a Batavian in command of Batavians. More often than not, other than in the early days when you're first producing auxiliary units for the Roman army, there's a pretty fair chance that your equestrian commander of a cohort would not be of the same ethnic group as the men he's commanding. On the other hand, that can't be ruled out. It probably happened. We don't know enough to really rule hard and fast on that. Anyway, you would do this. Again, the assumption has been you do this post for about 3 years. There's not a very strong basis for this assumption, but it still remains as a rule of thumb. Primarily, it's based upon the Jupiter Optimus Maximus altars dedicated at Maryport on the Cumbrian coast to the west of Hadrian's Wall, where it looked as if one of these altars was being erected every year for a dedication to the supreme god of Rome. And you've got the names of cohort commanders, and most of them seem to do about 3 years, or one or two do slightly more. I think there's at least one does 4, or appears on 4 altars, which just seem to be 4 years. They don't seem to do less. But again, things could happen. Somebody could become sick, they could die, they could be killed in battle, and they might not serve that full period. But that seems to be the impression. You have several years where, as far as we can tell, this is your first formal grounding in how the army works, being a soldier commanding a unit. if there's anything that happens, there's any preparation for this before that, we don't know about it. You then, after that, go to the next stage, which is to become the one of the junior tribunes of a legion, a narrow-stripe tribune, to mark out your equestrian rather than senatorial status. There are 5 of these in addition to the senatorial tribune in every legion. So, you know, there's a significant number of these posts, just there are a significant number of cohorts out there. For a brief period, the Emperor Claudius decided to make this the most senior of appointments and made it the 3rd post rather than the 2nd, but it didn't last. It very quickly came back to being the 2nd posting you have. So those who are pursuing a military career would go off and be a tribune. Again, we tend to assume for 3 years or so. This obviously is a rather different environment. It's going to bring you into a much larger unit than a cohort. You've got not only a senatorial tribune, you've got the senatorial commander, you have the prefect of the camp, Praefectus Castrorum, who is a very senior, most of the time a former senior centurion, equestrian like yourself now, but very much an old hand. He's been in the army a long time as an officer, so, you know, and you are in this much bigger group with its sense of corporate identity, a way of doing things. So it's a much less independent role. What you're actually doing during this time will depend upon deployment. And there's lots of administrative jobs, training jobs as well, building jobs, as well as there might be anything that's more specifically military. But you're getting experience with the other half of the Roman army, the citizen half of the army, and in a much bigger organization. You then, after that, return to the auxilia, and you become commander of a cavalry unit, an ala. There are some units that are double strength, some cavalry units. Normally you only get one of those after you've commanded an ordinary cavalry unit. Again, our rule of thumb is 3 years or so in this post. So, you know, you're looking at about 9-10 years altogether if you go through all 3. But that's guesswork. Some people might decide to spend far longer. Others, some of the high flyers, might get promoted more quickly, gain their status quickly. Others might decide that, well, I've commanded a cohort, that's all. I've done my bit for the empire, let's just go home and manage my country estates in southern Spain or North Africa or wherever it might be. We don't know enough about how these people move in and out of society and local politics and this sort of thing. It's interesting that they give you command of a cavalry unit last. They obviously seem to want you to have more experience, and this may well be, there are fewer cavalry units, purely cavalry units, than there are infantry cohorts. They are very expensive. You've got a lot of horses to look after and care for, and if you mess this up, then you can cost the state quite a lot, and you can render this unit inefficient quite quickly. So you're not trusted with an ala until you have some idea of what you're doing, at least in the main. There may be some exceptions to that, and it doesn't mean the system is infallible by any means, but that seems to be the idea. And then you're certainly not trusted with the miliary ala, the double strength ala, of which there never seems to be more than one in a province at any one time, certainly as normally part of its garrison. You're not trusted with that until you really know what you're doing and you've proved yourself on another cavalry unit first. So that's the normal equestrian career, the tres militiae, the 3 military posts. You might after that go on to higher things. You might go on to be an equestrian officer in Rome cohorts, Praetorian Guard, urban cohorts, that sort of thing. You might do well enough to get on the prefect procuratorial pathway, which means you might be a governor of a minor province or the financial official and administrative representative of the emperor in a major military province governed by a senator. So there are other things beyond that, and we'll go into that when we do a longer video in more detail about the command. But that's basically for the commanders that affect the army in the field. That's where you get there. One final thing to say is that there are a proportion of equestrians who decide not to follow that path and instead become legionary centurions. And they tell us this on inscriptions, that they're directly commissioned from the equestrian order. Probably fairly rare, probably always a minority of centurions out there, but nevertheless there are a lot of centurial posts. Don't necessarily prove to be high flyers, but they might decide perhaps you could spend longer with the army if you wanted to as a legionary centurion. Perhaps it's a reflection of financial resources may well have been more expensive to keep up the household, the standard of living expected of a prefect of an auxiliary cohort and beyond, a tribune and the like. We don't know, we just know that this happened, that some people decided to follow that career path which is different, and they don't seem to cross over. These people don't seem to then later on decide, I'll become an equestrian officer instead, and I'll be a prefect in charge of a cohort, I'll be a tribune in a legion. So it's not as if you do a few years as a centurion to find out this is how the army works, this is how I become an officer and learn your business, and then move on to these other posts. It seems to be entirely separate. Centurionate, otherwise, is another big question that we won't deal with. So the rest of but generally speaking, that grade of officer, and that's what centurion means rather than a specific rank, is kept separate from the sort of formal equestrian career we've talked about, and even more so from the formal senatorial career. But that's a quick breakdown, quick introduction to the senior officers of the Roman army.